In 2026, a parliamentary investigation in Australia received 286 formal testimonies from former members of high-control religious groups. When researchers analyzed which organization appeared most often, the results surprised even the investigators themselves. Not Scientology, not the church that triggered the inquiry. The group with the highest number of complaints, by a wide margin, was Jehovah's Witnesses. 48 formal submissions. 48 individual accounts describing psychological manipulation, forced family separation, and decades of fear used as a tool of institutional control. And right now, a government committee is reading every single one. The final report is due in September 2026. What it recommends could change the legal status of religious organizations across Australia. Permanently. This is that story. Block 2. How we got here. It started with a podcast. In late 2024, investigative journalist Richard Baker released a 9-part audio series called Secrets We Keep, Pray Harder. The series exposed, through detailed first-hand testimony, decades of abuse and psychological control inside a Pentecostal congregation called the Geelong Revival Centre, a church based in a mid-sized city south of Melbourne. The public response was immediate. Australians began sharing their own stories on social media. Former members of entirely different religious organizations broke silences that had lasted decades. And within months, the pressure became too strong for lawmakers to ignore. On April 3, 2025, the Parliament of Victoria voted to launch a formal inquiry. The mandate was broad: examine high-control religious groups, their recruitment methods, the mechanisms they use to keep members inside, and the documented harm inflicted on those who eventually managed to leave. Over the months that followed, 286 formal submissions were filed. What those submissions describe together is not a series of isolated incidents. It is a pattern, a recognizable, repeating, cross-organizational pattern of psychological coercion that former members say they can identify regardless of which group they came from. And when the numbers were counted, one organization stood above all the others. What a high-control group actually is. Before going further, it is worth understanding exactly what this inquiry is examining, and what it is not. The committee chair, Ella George, was explicit about this from the beginning. This investigation is not a debate about religious belief. It is not a judgment about which scripture is more valid, which God is real, or which tradition deserves respect. What is being examined is institutional behavior. Specifically, what happens when a religious organization stops limiting its authority to the spiritual dimension of a person's life and begins extending that authority into everything else. What members are permitted to read, who they are allowed to speak with, whether their children can pursue a university education, whether they can disagree with a leader without facing consequences, whether they are allowed, in any meaningful sense, to think for themselves. An anonymous questionnaire offered to participants in the inquiry produced a result that researchers described as striking. 95% of respondents said they experienced psychological harm after leaving these groups. Not a majority, not most of them. 95%. The symptoms were consistent across dozens of testimonies from dozens of entirely different organizations. Chronic anxiety, clinical depression, social isolation so severe it persisted for years after leaving, an inability to maintain ordinary human relationships, because everything these people had ever learned about trust, connection, and community had been filtered through the rules of the group. One submission described the experience in terms that the committee would later cite in its own documents. The person wrote that they had literally become a puppet, and that you could watch the lights go out. The first witnesses. The first witnesses to appear before the committee were Ryan and Catherine Carey, former members of the Geelong Revival Centre, and founders of an organization created specifically to support people recovering from cultic involvement. Ryan Carey's opening testimony set the tone for everything that followed. He described growing up inside a group that, in his own words, acted like its own state. It had its own rules, its own enforcement mechanisms, its own internal surveillance network. From the day he was born, he explained, he may have technically lived in the state of Victoria, but in every practical sense, he answered to the cult and its leader. Any incident, including criminal behavior, was required to go to leadership before anyone was permitted to contact police. Their authority, he said, was considered higher than the law of the land. Richard Baker, the journalist who broke the original story, appeared alongside the Careys. He told the committee that what Victoria was examining was not a local anomaly. The structural architecture of these groups, the promise of eternal salvation paired with the ever-present threat of divine punishment for those who question, is not unique to one church in one Australian city. It repeats across high-control organizations around the world, across decades, across generations. The committee also heard from practitioners at the Religious Trauma Collective, mental health professionals with years of clinical experience treating people who had left these groups. Their argument was legally precise. Religious trauma should not be treated as a spiritual category. It should be treated as what it actually is: a form of psychological abuse inflicted through coercive institutional control. And it deserves the same legal recognition already applied to coercive control in domestic relationships. The number that changed the investigation. As the submissions were filed and the committee began its analysis, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the national public broadcaster, conducted an independent systematic review of every public submission to map which organizations were actually being described. Of all the religious groups mentioned in the inquiry, excluding those named in fewer than 4 submissions, the results produced a ranking that surprised researchers who had been following the process closely. Jehovah's Witnesses, 48 submissions. The Geelong Revival Centre, the group whose exposure had triggered the entire inquiry, 25. The Church of Scientology, 4. Other organizations mentioned included the City Builders Church, the 2x2s, and the Korean New Religious Movement, Shincheonji. The organization at the top of the list, by a significant margin, was Jehovah's Witnesses. The advocacy organization Say Sorry, which has documented former members' experiences in Australia since 2018, published all 48 submissions on its website. Some were brief, others ran close to 100 pages, supported by decades of internal Watchtower publications that former members had preserved specifically as documentation. Taken together, they describe a pattern that survivors say they recognize, regardless of which country they grew up in, which decade they left, or how large their congregation was, and that pattern begins in childhood. One former member described being shown, as a young child, graphic illustrated images of Armageddon, mass death, destruction, the annihilation of every living person outside the organization, used not as theology in any traditional sense, but as a management tool for controlling behavior. We were shown pictures of people dying at Armageddon, the submission read, which as a child was terrifying. That fear, survivors explain, does not dissolve when you grow up. It calcifies into the invisible architecture of every decision you make for the rest of your life. Do you leave and risk everything you have ever known and face a God who, according to everything you were taught from the moment you could form a thought, is watching and keeping score? The cost of leaving. For those who eventually do leave, there is a second mechanism waiting. It is called shunning, formerly known within Jehovah's Witnesses as disfellowshipping, and it is arguably the single most legally significant practice currently under examination by the committee. Shunning involves the systematic severing of all social contact between the organization and any individual who leaves voluntarily or is formally expelled. Not distance from strangers, not reduced contact with acquaintances. Complete severance from parents, from siblings, from people you sat next to at the dinner table for the first 18 years of your life. Former members who submitted testimony described losing everything at once, not just their faith, which many describe as taking years to process on its own, but their entire social infrastructure. Every friendship ever built, every family relationship, every version of themselves that existed in relationship to another human being. One submission described a moment that the committee found particularly difficult to move past. A family member arrived at the door holding a box. Inside were every photograph ever taken of that person during their childhood, every image of a life lived together, handed back without ceremony. And the family member said, "You are no longer my son," not because of anything criminal, not because of any act of violence, because that person had left the religion. Legal scholars and psychologists following this inquiry have described shunning as the sharpest test of what the committee is ultimately trying to determine. Is it a religious practice protected under freedom of belief? Or is it a coercive control mechanism that inflicts documented, measurable, long-term psychological harm on identifiable individuals? The organization's own submission denies that shunning as practiced constitutes abuse. 48 former members describe something different. The committee will have to decide which account better reflects reality, and that decision alone could set a precedent reaching far beyond Australia. The money. There is one dimension of this inquiry that has received less public attention than the psychological testimony, but which may ultimately produce the most concrete legal consequences. Money. The ABC's investigation went beyond counting submissions. Journalists also examined the financial standing of these organizations under Australian charity law. Of the 7 organizations named in 4 or more submissions, 6 are currently registered as charities through the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. That registration provides significant tax advantages, and until now, very limited public accountability over how donated funds are actually used. The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Australia declared total revenue of nearly 18 million Australian dollars for the period ending in August 2025. The Church of Scientology declared over $21 million in the same period, with total assets approaching $138 million. Taxation expert and associate professor Dale Boccabella from the University of New South Wales appeared before the committee and was direct. There should be a threshold, he argued, at which charitable status is forfeited. When an organization is directing significant revenue toward accumulating institutional wealth rather than toward charitable purposes, the legal justification for tax exemption deserves serious scrutiny. The committee's deputy chair, Annabelle Cleland, put it plainly. Basic religious charity status under federal law currently grants generous tax concessions while shielding organizations from standard financial reporting requirements. There is, she said, very little accountability over how much money is in there or where it goes. Former members who donated over decades, who gave unpaid labor to build congregation facilities, who handed over a portion of every paycheck because they were told their faith required it, say they were never given any accounting of how those contributions were used, or what the organization's actual assets were worth. The organizations respond. The organizations named in the inquiry were each given the opportunity to respond. Scientology issued a formal statement describing the submissions against it as unfounded and warned that the inquiry risked adversely affecting legitimate religious practices. The Church also noted, pointedly, that submissions filed under parliamentary privilege allow former members to make claims that would otherwise expose them to defamation proceedings, a legal observation that critics described as a veiled warning to potential witnesses. The Geelong Revival Centre and Shincheonji did not respond to media requests for comment. Jehovah's Witnesses responded through their national spokesperson in Australia, Tom Pekipaikovsky. His statement was brief and carefully worded. While it appears that Jehovah's Witnesses are not the intended focus of the inquiry, he said, "We respect each individual's right to share their experiences and perspectives. However, we have no desire to engage in public debate or dispute with former members." The organization did not appear before the committee in person. It did file a written submission, one that challenged the credibility of specific witnesses, denied the core allegations, and argued that the claim that membership or former membership drives loneliness and isolation in Australia is entirely unfounded. The committee will weigh that submission alongside 48 others describing something very different. The other side. Not everyone believes this inquiry is moving in the right direction, and those concerns deserve acknowledgement. Freedom for faith. Executive Director Mike Southan appeared before the committee and described genuine fear spreading through faith communities across Australia. The danger of defining a cult through legislation, he warned, is that if your definition captures groups requiring high commitment, financial contribution, lifestyle changes, and restrictions on certain associations, you have potentially described a large number of churches that no reasonable person would classify as abusive. These are not frivolous concerns. The line between a demanding religious community and a coercive control system is genuinely difficult to define in legal language. What makes this inquiry significant is not that it has resolved that tension. It has not. What makes it significant is that it has forced the question into a public forum, with documented evidence, in a jurisdiction with the authority to act on what it finds. The verdict is coming. The Legal and Social Issues Committee of the Victorian Parliament is expected to deliver its final report by September 30th, 2026. That report could recommend changes to charity law that revoke tax-exempt status from organizations found to cause systematic harm. It could recommend a formal legal category for coercive group control, extending to religious organizations the same frameworks already applied to domestic abusers. It could recommend government funding for survivor support networks and specialized mental health services for people exiting these groups. Or it could find that the risks of regulatory overreach outweigh the documented harms. No one outside the committee room knows yet which way the findings will go. What is no longer deniable, what 286 submissions have made impossible to dismiss, is that for decades these organizations operated in near total institutional silence. Former members who spoke publicly were discredited, threatened, or simply not believed. Governments categorized what was happening as private religious practice and looked away. And survivors were left to rebuild their lives alone, without acknowledgement, without support, and without any formal recognition that what happened to them was real. That silence is ending. In Victoria, Australia, in 2026, 286 people sat down and wrote what they had never been permitted to say out loud. 48 of those accounts described experiences inside one organization. A government is now reading every word, and in September they will render a verdict. If this investigation reached you, subscribe to this channel. New investigations go up regularly, built on the same principle: evidence first, survivors' voices first, and a commitment to reporting honestly on institutions that have operated in the dark for far too long. If you have personal experience inside a high-control religious group, any group, leave a comment below. Your account may be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.